April 1457, a banquet hall in Wallachia. 200 noblewomen sit beside their husbands, dressed in Venetian silk, drinking wine, celebrating Easter. They think they are safe. They are wrong. By sunrise, their husbands will be dead, impaled in the courtyard. And these women, daughters of aristocrats who had never touched dirt in their lives, will begin a death march to the mountains. One of them was named Voica. 23 years old, her hands had never held anything heavier than a silver goblet. Within days, those hands would be raw meat, nails torn off, bones visible through the skin as she dragged stones up a cliff to build a castle for the man who murdered her husband. She worked until her clothes rotted off her body, until there was nothing left to cover her but mud and blood. What Vlad Dracula did to women was not a side effect of war. It was the strategy. Hollywood gave you a vampire who seduces. History gave you a monster who destroys. This is the story of the women history decided you should never know about. The wind howling through the stone arches of Targoviste carried the bite of a late winter frost, refusing to yield to the coming spring. It was Easter Sunday, 1457, yet the capital of Wallachia felt less like a city in celebration and more like a beast holding its breath. Outside the thick citadel walls, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unshed rain that slicked the cobblestones and made the iron torches hiss. Inside the great hall of the princely court, however, the air was thick with the smell of roasted boar, spiced wine, and the heavy perfume of 200 noble families gathered for the feast. Voica sat near the center of the long table, her fingers tracing the rim of her silver goblet. At 23 years old, she was a vision of sheltered elegance, with cascading dark hair pinned back by pearls and skin that had never known the harshness of the sun. She wore a gown of crimson silk imported from Venice, the heavy fabric rustling softly against the floor with every shift of her body. Beside her sat her husband, André, a minor nobleman with a broad, confident smile, and hands that were more accustomed to signing treaties than wielding swords. He laughed at a jest made by the man across from them, his cheeks flushed with wine, completely unaware that this was the last time he would ever laugh. "Drink, my love," André whispered, leaning close to Voica, his breath warm against her ear. "The prince is generous tonight. Look at this spread. It is a sign of peace." Voica forced a smile, though a cold knot tightened in her stomach. She looked up toward the head of the table. There sat Vlad III, the ruler they called the Impaler. He was a man of terrifying stillness, clad in black velvet that seemed to absorb the candlelight. His face was pale, his eyes large and unblinking, scanning the room not like a host, but like a wolf watching a herd of fattened sheep. He did not eat, he did not drink, he only watched. The music swelled, lutes and drums drowning out the whisper of the wind outside. The boyars, the noble class of Wallachia, reveled in their grandeur. They adjusted their heavy gold chains and smoothed their brocade tunics, comfortable in their power. They believed themselves untouchable, the true makers of kings. Suddenly, Vlad raised a single hand. The music died instantly. The laughter choked off. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Vlad stood up slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room, lingering on the oldest faces, then the youngest. "My noble guests," Vlad's voice was soft, yet it carried to the farthest corners of the hall. "I have a question for you on this holy day." He stepped down from the dais, walking slowly among the tables. The nobles stiffened. "How many princes?" Vlad paused, resting his hand on the shoulder of an elderly boyar. "Have you seen sit upon this throne in your lifetime?" The old man, thinking this was a test of his longevity and wisdom, puffed out his chest. "Your Highness, I have served 7 voivodes." Vlad nodded, his face unreadable. He moved to another. "And you?" 12, my lord," another shouted proudly. 30! cried a voice from the back, accompanied by drunken laughter. 30 princes have come and gone! Vlad stopped moving. The ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it did not reach his eyes. 30, he repeated. You have survived 30 rulers. The hall went deathly quiet. How is it, Vlad roared, his voice suddenly thundering off the stone walls, that you survive, while 30 of my countrymen, 30 of your princes have died? You swore loyalty to them all, and you betrayed them all. Voica gripped Andrei's arm, her fingernails digging into his velvet sleeve. Andrei was no longer smiling. His face had gone the color of ash. You are not nobles, Vlad spat, the veneer of the host vanishing to reveal the executioner beneath. You are parasites. He snapped his fingers. The heavy oak doors of the great hall slammed shut with a boom that shook the floor. From the shadows of the arched corridors, Vlad's personal guard, the Kalarashi, emerged. They were not dressed for a feast. They were dressed for war. Swords drawn, faces covered in chainmail. Chaos erupted. Women screamed as tables were overturned, sending platters of meat and flagons of wine crashing to the stone floor. Voica was thrown from her chair as soldiers surged forward. She scrambled backward, her silk dress tangling around her legs, frantically searching for Andrei. Voica! Andrei shouted, reaching for her. Before their hands could touch, a soldier's gauntleted fist struck Andrei across the jaw. He fell heavily, blood spraying onto the pristine white tablecloth. Two guards seized him by the arms, hauling him up. No, please! Voica screamed, lunging forward, but a rough hand grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back. She watched, helpless, as the men, the powerful boyars who had boasted of their survival moments ago, were dragged toward the courtyard doors. Vlad stood amidst the carnage, calm and immovable. Take the men to the stakes, Vlad commanded, his voice cutting through the screams. Let them look upon the city they betrayed one last time. Andrei twisted in the grip of the guards, his eyes locking with Voica's. There was no bravery in them, only the sheer, primal terror of a man who knows he is about to die. Then, he was gone, dragged into the dark, rainy night. Voica collapsed to her knees, sobbing, but the nightmare was not over. The guards turned their attention to the women. Get up, a soldier barked, kicking Voica in the ribs. She gasped, clutching her side. Around her, 200 noblewomen were being rounded up. Their fine jewelry was ripped from their necks, pearls scattering across the blood-stained floor like tears. They were not being killed. Not yet. Heavy iron shackles were brought out. Voica felt the cold metal snap around her delicate wrists, the weight of it pulling her shoulders down. She looked down at her dress. The crimson silk she had been so proud of was now torn and stained with wine and dirt. Move! Chained together in a long, weeping line, the women were forced toward the exit. As they stepped out into the freezing courtyard, the screams of their husbands began to rise above the wind, a horrific chorus that signaled the beginning of the end. Voica squeezed her eyes shut, but she could not shut out the sound. The feast was over. The death march had begun. The sun did not rise on the first day of the march. The sky simply turned a lighter shade of gray, revealing the endless stretch of mud that lay ahead. The road north from Târgoviște was not a road at all, but a scar cut through the wilderness, churned into a quagmire by the hooves of the guards' horses. Voica stumbled, her breath catching in her throat as the iron chain connecting her to the woman ahead yanked taut. Her feet, encased in slippers of embroidered velvet meant for dancing on marble floors, were already bleeding. The thin soles had shredded miles ago, leaving her skin exposed to sharp stones and the freezing slush. Every step was a fresh agony, a sharp reminder that the life she knew was dead. Beside her walked Ileana, a distant cousin who had once been known for her laughter and her appetite for sweet pastries. Now Ileana was a ghost. Her round, soft face was streaked with mud and tears, her breathing ragged and wet. She clutched the heavy gold chain that still hung around her neck, a mockery of wealth that she was too terrified to discard. "I can't," Ileana wheezed, her voice barely a whisper over the sound of the wind. "Voica, my heart, it feels like it's going to burst." "You must," Voica whispered back, not looking at her. She kept her eyes on the mud. To look up was to attract the attention of the Kalarashi. "Just keep moving your feet, one then the other." The guards rode alongside the column of chained women, their horses tall and well-fed, steaming in the cold air. They carried whips of braided leather, and they used them with a casual cruelty, striking anyone who slowed the pace. They did not speak to the women as humans. They drove them like cattle. By the third day, the hunger had set in, a gnawing void that made Voica's head spin. But it was the sights along the road that hollowed her out completely. As the column wound its way through a small, silent village near the foothills, the procession came to a halt. The village was eerily quiet. No dogs barked, no children played. The peasants stood in their doorways, heads bowed low, refusing to look at the noblewomen. In the center of the village square, a single stake had been driven into the earth. Voica tried to look away, but the chain pulled her forward. The body on the stake was a woman. She had been there for days. Her face was twisted in a final silent scream, and her peasant dress was torn. A captain of the guard, a man with a scar running through his beard and eyes like flint, reined his horse in. He gestured to the corpse with his whip. "Look," he commanded. "All of you, look at her." The noblewomen wept, some retching into the mud. "This is Ilinka," the captain announced, his voice carrying over the sobbing. "Do you know why she rots here? Was she a traitor? A spy? No." He leaned down from his saddle, staring directly at Voica. "She was lazy. Her husband was seen walking the road with a shirt too short, exposing his legs. Because she did not sew for him, because she did not care for her household." The captain straightened up, sneering. "In Prince Vlad's land, neglect is a crime. Laziness is treason. If a peasant woman dies for a shirt, imagine what he has planned for you useless sows, who have never lifted a finger in your lives." The message hit Voica harder than any whip. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a system, a terrifying absolute order where perfection was the only defense against death. They were forced to march on, leaving Ilinka's warning behind. The terrain grew steeper as they approached the mountains. The mud turned to jagged shale that sliced through the remnants of their shoes. As the sun began to set, casting long, predatory shadows across the path, Ileana stumbled. It wasn't a slip this time. Her legs simply folded beneath her. She hit the ground with a heavy thud, dragging Voica down with her. "Get up!" Voica hissed, panic seizing her chest. She grabbed Ileana's arm, trying to haul her up. "Ileana, please, they are coming." "I can't." Ileana's eyes were glassy, staring at nothing. "Leave me here. It's warm. I just want to sleep." The thunder of hooves approached. The captain loomed over them, his horse blocking the fading light. "She is finished," the captain said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded bored. "No!" Voica cried, struggling to lift her cousin's dead weight. "She can walk. Give us a moment." The captain drew a knife. For a second, Voica thought he would kill Ileana there. Instead, he leaned down and slashed the leather strap that bound Ileana to the main chain. "We do not wait for the dead," he said. He cracked his whip, the tip slicing Voica's shoulder. "Move!" "Voica!" Ileana whispered, reaching out a hand. Her fingers brushed Voica's hem. Voica looked at the guard, then at the dark forest bordering the road. From the shadows she heard it, a low, rhythmic chuffing, then a howl, then another. The wolves had been tracking them for miles, waiting for a straggler. "Move, or you join her!" the captain roared. Voica looked at Ileana one last time. She saw the terror in her cousin's eyes, the plea for salvation. But she also saw the truth. Ileana was already gone. To stay was to die. Voica turned away. She forced her legs to move. She forced her back to straighten. Behind her, Ileana screamed, a high, piercing sound that cut through the twilight. Then came the snarling, the sound of tearing fabric and wet thuds. Voica did not look back. She did not cover her ears. She let the sounds carve themselves into her memory. The tears that had blurred her vision for 3 days finally stopped. Her eyes felt dry, burning and clear. The soft girl who danced in silk was dead, left in the mud beside her cousin. What remained was something harder, something cold. She walked on into the darkness, the rhythm of her steps matching the beat of her hardening heart. The ruins of Poenari stood atop a jagged needle of rock, piercing the low-hanging clouds like a broken tooth. To reach it, one had to tilt their head back until their neck ached, looking up a vertical wall of limestone and cruel geography. The Agesh River roared below, a churning ribbon of gray water that sounded less like a river and more like a hungry beast waiting for scraps. When the column of women finally halted at the base of the cliff, there was no speech, no grand proclamation from the prince. There were only the guards, the piles of raw limestone, and the whips. "Up!" the captain with the scar barked, pointing to the winding, treacherous goat path that scratched its way up the mountain. "The prince demands a fortress. You are the mules who will give it to him." Voica stared at the rock in front of her. It was jagged, heavy, and cold. She bent down, her trembling fingers gripping the rough edges. As she lifted it, a sharp edge sliced into her palm. She didn't flinch. She simply turned and began to climb. Time dissolved. There were no days or nights, only the gray light of labor and the black void of exhaustion. The transformation was slow, agonizing, and absolute. First, it was the dignity that died. Then, the modesty. The crimson silk dress from Venice, once the envy of the court, began to betray her. The sharp rocks snagged the fine fabric, tearing long strips from the hem. The rain soaked the velvet until it rotted against her skin, heavy and smelling of mildew. The bodice, strained by the constant heaving of stone, split at the seams. By the second week, the women of Wallachia were no longer recognizable as humans. They were skeletal figures caked in mud and dried blood, their hair matted nests of lice and dirt. At night, when the guards allowed them to stop, they did not build fires. They collapsed onto the bare stone of the unfinished ramparts, huddled together in a shivering pile of limbs, seeking warmth from one another's bodies like a pack of stray dogs. The shame of their nakedness had vanished, replaced by a singular consuming need to survive the cold. Voica lay in the center of the pile one night, her head resting on the hip of a woman whose name she had forgotten. She looked at her hands in the moonlight. They were ruined. The skin on her palms had been flayed away days ago, leaving raw, weeping meat. Her fingernails were gone, torn off by the weight of the limestone, and through the tattered remains of her skin, she could see the white gleam of her own knuckles. They looked like something a butcher would discard, yet they were the only tools she had. "Morning!" The shout came too soon, accompanied by the crack of leather on flesh. Voica pushed herself up. Her body screamed in protest, every joint locked with pain. She stumbled to the pile of rocks. She selected a stone, heavy, uneven, with a sharp corner, and hoisted it to her shoulder. The raw flesh of her shoulder burned as the rock settled into the open wound it had carved there over the last 10 days. She began the ascent. The path was slick with morning dew and the blood of those who had climbed before her. Her legs shook violently. Step, breath, step, breath. Higher up, near the foundation of the main tower, a wooden platform had been erected. A figure stood there watching the ants work below. Voica's foot found a patch of loose shale. It happened in a heartbeat. The stone shifted under her weight. Her ankle twisted, and she pitched forward. The heavy limestone block on her shoulder slipped, crashing down onto her forearm before tumbling over the edge of the cliff. Voica cried out, a dry, raspy sound, and collapsed to her knees, clutching her crushed arm. A shadow fell over her. A guard, a young man with cruel eyes, stepped forward, raising his whip. "Clumsy cow," he snarled. "That stone is worth more than your life." Voica curled into a ball, waiting for the bite of the lash. She could not stand. She could not lift another rock. If he struck her now, she would simply let go and slide off the edge into the river below. It would be easier. "Wait!" The voice was soft, barely a whisper over the wind, yet it carried the weight of iron. The guard froze, the whip raised high. He turned toward the wooden platform. Standing there was a woman. She was wrapped in a heavy cloak of dark fur, her face pale and framed by intricate braids of gold thread. It was the princess, Vlad's wife. She was not a prisoner in chains, yet her eyes held the same haunted emptiness as the women carrying the stones. She stood rigid, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She did not look at the guard. She looked directly at Voica. For a second, the distance between them vanished. The woman in the fur and the woman in the rags locked eyes. In the princess's gaze, Voica saw no pity. Pity was useless here. She saw recognition. She saw a silent apology. "My sash," the princess said, her voice trembling slightly. She pointed a manicured finger at the ground near Voica's feet, where a strip of blue silk had fallen from the platform above. "That slave. She is dirtying my sash." The guard blinked, confused. "My lady?" "Pick it up," the princess commanded, her voice sharpening with feigned arrogance. "Before she bleeds on it. Do not let the whip touch her, or the spray will ruin the fabric. Move her aside." The guard lowered his whip, grumbling. He shoved Voica with his boot, but without the lethal force he had intended. "Get out of the way. Go get another rock." He bent to retrieve the fallen silk. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. The pause allowed the black spots in Voica's vision to clear. It allowed her lungs to draw a single, ragged breath. Voica looked up at the platform. The princess turned her back, wrapping her furs tighter around herself, and walked away into the shadows of the tower. Voica used her uninjured arm to claw at the dirt, dragging herself upright. She was still in hell. She was still bleeding, but she was alive. She turned back to the pile of stones. She would carry another. Not for Vlad, not for the fear of the whip, but because a woman in a tower had just bought her 5 seconds of life, and she would not waste them. Summer arrived not with warmth, but with a scorching, relentless heat that baked the limestone cliffs until they radiated like the walls of an oven. The mud of spring had turned to choking gray dust that coated the women's throats and stung their eyes. 6 months had passed since the first stone was laid. The Poenari fortress was rising, a jagged crown of gray teeth biting into the sky. But the cost of its ascent was measured in the thinning ranks of its builders. Voica moved among the survivors like a shadow. Her hands, now thick with calluses and scarred tissue, had forgotten the touch of silk. She had become the silent anchor of the group. When a woman collapsed from the heat, it was Voica who whispered fierce words of encouragement. When the water rations, muddy sludge from the river bottom, were distributed, Voica ensured the youngest drank first. She had learned that survival here was not a solitary act. It was a collective resistance. Among the workers were Elena and her 14-year-old daughter, Sophia. Elena was a woman who had once been known for her singing voice, but now she saved her breath for lifting stones. Sophia, barely more than a child, had withered in the harsh conditions, her ribs pressing against her sun-blackened skin like the bars of a birdcage. "Stay close to me," Elena would whisper to Sophia 100 times a day, shielding the girl's body with her own whenever the guards passed. "We are almost done. Just one more stone." But the fortress was never done, and the prince was never satisfied. Vlad III visited the construction site often. He did not come to inspect the architectural integrity of the walls or the strategic value of the towers. He came to inspect the women. He would stand on the high ramparts, his black cloak hanging still in the stagnant air, watching the labor below, with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing insects. He believed that the foundation of a kingdom was not stone, but obedience. And total obedience could only be forged in the fires of total terror. To him, every stumble, every gasp of exhaustion, was a weakness that had to be purged from Wallachhia's soul. It happened during the midday meal, when the sun was at its zenith. The guards had thrown scraps of stale bread onto the dirt, the daily ration. Elena grabbed a piece, but she did not eat it. With a sleight of hand born of desperation, she tucked the hard crust into the folds of Sophia's rags. It was a tiny rebellion, a mother's attempt to give her child strength for the afternoon climb. "You there?" A voice sliced through the heat. It was not a guard. It was Vlad. He had descended from the ramparts silently. He stood only a few paces away, his eyes fixed on Elena's trembling hands. The silence that fell over the quarry was absolute. Even the river seemed to hush. "Bring them here," Vlad said softly. Two guards dragged Elena and Sophia forward. They fell to their knees in the dust, clutching each other. "Mercy, my lord," Elena begged, her voice cracking. "It was only bread. She is starving. She is just a child." Vlad looked at Sophia. He did not see a child. He saw a flaw. "There is no child or adult in duty," Vlad said, his voice devoid of anger, which made it all the more terrifying. "There is only order. If you hide bread, you hide secrets. If you hide secrets, you breed treason." He turned to the guards. The stake. Voica stood frozen in the crowd of watching women. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to scream, to throw a rock, to do something. But the memory of the princess on the tower held her back. "Live," the memory whispered. "You must live to tell this." The guards did not take Elena. They took Sophia. "No!" Elena shrieked, lunging forward. But a guard slammed the butt of his spear into her stomach. She collapsed, gasping, forced to watch as they dragged her weeping daughter to the center of the clearing. Vlad signaled. He wanted this to be slow. He wanted it to be a lesson. "Watch," Vlad commanded Elena. "You tried to feed her body to save her. Now you will watch her body become a message to save your soul." The stake was not tall, but it was sharp. What followed was a horror that defied the capacity of the human mind to process. Sophia's screams were high and thin, piercing the heavy summer air, echoing off the valley walls until it seemed the mountains themselves were screaming. Elena did not look away. She could not. She clawed at the dirt, her mouth open in a silent wail that was more haunting than any sound. She died 1,000 times in those minutes, her sanity fracturing with every cry from her child. Voica bit her lip. She bit down until the copper taste of blood filled her mouth. She bit down until she felt the skin tear, using the sharp, stinging pain to anchor herself, to keep the scream locked inside her throat. If she screamed, she would be next. And if she died, who would remember Sophia? When it was over, Sophia's small, broken body hung limp against the wood. Vlad walked over to Elena, who lay catatonic in the dust, her eyes wide and unseeing. "Now," Vlad said, looking at the other women, his gaze sweeping over Voica. "Build my walls higher, or you will join her." He turned and walked away, leaving the mother alone with her child's corpse. Voica swallowed the blood in her mouth. She picked up a stone. It was heavy, but the weight in her heart was heavier. She would carry it. She would carry it all. The silence of Poenari Castle was heavier than the stones that built it. For months, the air had been filled with the cracking of whips, the grinding of limestone, and the screams of the dying. Now, there was only the wind whistling through the arrow slits and the soft rhythmic rasp of a brush against cold rock. The fortress was finished. It crowned the mountain like a vulture's skull, bleached and impenetrable. Of the 200 women who had marched from Târgoviște in their Easter finery, fewer than a dozen remained. They were no longer the daughters of boyars. They were the ghosts of the castle, their names erased, their titles replaced by the coarse wool of servants' tunics. Voica knelt on the flagstones of the upper corridor, her hands scrubbing a stain that would never truly lift. Her fingers, once raw meat and exposed bone, had healed into twisted knots of scar tissue that ached in the damp mountain air. She scrubbed mechanically, her eyes fixed on the gray stone. She knew the cost of every block in this wall. She knew which stones held Elena's tears and which ones had crushed Ileana's legs. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum, and she was the caretaker of her own graveyard. "You!" a guard grunted, nudging her with the toe of his boot. "Up! The mistress demands the solar be cleaned, and do not look at her. You are furniture. Do you understand?" Voica nodded, keeping her gaze lowered. She gathered her bucket and rags, rising stiffly. The solar was at the pinnacle of the high tower, the only room in the fortress designed for comfort. As Voica pushed open the heavy oak door, she was struck by a wave of warmth, the scent of lavender and burning beeswax. It was a jarring reminder of the life she had lost. Tapestries hung from the walls, softening the brutal stone, and a fire crackled in the hearth. Sitting by the narrow window was the princess. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, trimmed with silver fox fur, untouched by the dust that coated the rest of the world. But as Voica moved silently to the hearth to sweep the ashes, she saw the truth beneath the finery. The princess was trembling. Her hands resting on her lap, picked incessantly at the embroidery of her dress, unraveling the gold thread loop by loop. Every time a log shifted in the fire, she flinched, her eyes darting toward the door with the terror of a trapped animal. Voica watched her from the corner of her eye. She had hated this woman for months, hated her for her warmth, for her food, for her safety while Sofia died on a stake. But looking at her now, Voica felt the hatred cool into something grayer, sadder. The princess was not safe. She was merely a prisoner in a more expensive cell. In Vlad's kingdom, there were no queens, only victims waiting for their turn. The princess turned from the window. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. She saw Voica watching her. For a moment, neither of them breathed. The guard stood outside the door, oblivious. The princess stood up. She did not shout. She did not call the guard. She walked stiffly toward the large four-poster bed that dominated the room. Her eyes locked onto Voica's, an intense, pleading stare that burned with urgency. "The linens," the princess said, her voice brittle and loud enough for the guard to hear. "They are stiff. Change them. Now." She gestured to the pillows, her hand lingering for a fraction of a second too long. Then, she turned her back, walking to the far side of the room to pour a cup of wine, her hands shaking so badly the decanter rattled against the goblet. Voica moved to the bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a familiar rhythm of fear. She stripped the silk case from the pillow nearest the wall, There, resting on the mattress, were two objects: a small paring knife, its handle inlaid with mother of pearl, delicate but sharp enough to cut a throat, and beside it, a torn scrap of parchment. Voica's hand moved with the speed of a thief. She snatched the items, shoving them deep into the waistband of her wool tunic, covering them with her sash. She unfolded the fresh linen with a snap, masking the rustle of the paper. As she smoothed the new pillowcase, she glanced at the parchment in her mind's eye. It was a drawing, a crude sketch of the castle's lower levels, with a jagged line traced in charcoal leading from the kitchens to the riverbank. A way out. Voica finished the bed and picked up her bucket. She turned to leave. The princess was watching her reflection in the dark wine. She did not turn around, but as Voica reached the door, the princess spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I am sorry." It was soft, carried away by the draft from the window, but Voica heard it. It was an apology for the stones, for the cold, for Sophia, for the sash, for the silence. Voica paused, her hand on the iron latch. She could not speak, speech was forbidden, but she let the bucket clink once against the stone floor. A sound of acknowledgement, a sound of acceptance. She stepped out into the cold corridor, the knife pressing against her hip like a burning coal. The castle was still a prison, and the ghost of the Impaler still walked its halls. But for the first time in years, Voica was not just a survivor. She was armed. June 1462 brought a heat that sat heavy on the chest, a stifling blanket of humidity that trapped the smells of the earth. But around Poenari Castle, the air carried a scent that had nothing to do with summer. It was a cloying, sweet rot stench that tasted like copper on the back of the tongue. Voica stood in the shadows of the great hall, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to hide their trembling. She was no longer just a body that scrubbed floors. She was a listener, a spy in her own prison. The castle was frantic with activity. Soldiers ran back and forth, sharpening blades and packing saddlebags, their eyes wide with a fear that they dared not voice. At the head of the heavy oak table sat Vlad. He was writing. The scratching of his quill against the parchment was the only steady sound in the room. He did not look like a man facing the largest army the world had ever seen. He looked like an accountant tallying a ledger. 23,884, Vlad murmured, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He was reading aloud as he wrote, not counting those burned in their homes. Standing beside him was a captain named Dragos, a burly man whose face was currently the color of old parchment. "My lord," Dragos stammered, wiping sweat from his brow. "The scouts report the Sultan is less than a day's ride from Targoviste. His army, it stretches from horizon to horizon. 100,000 men. We cannot hold the capital. We cannot even hold this mountain." Vlad stopped writing. He looked up, his eyes dark and calm. "Who said we are going to hold it?" Voica stepped forward to refill the captain's goblet. She moved with the practiced invisibility of a servant, but her ears strained to catch every syllable. "We do not fight Mehmed with swords, Dragos," Vlad said, standing up and walking to the narrow window that overlooked the valley. "We fight him with his own stomach. We fight him with his nightmares." He turned back, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "When the Sultan reaches Targoviste, he will find the city empty, but the fields will be full." "The prisoners?" Dragos whispered, revulsion warring with loyalty in his tone. "The message," Vlad corrected. 20,000 of them, raised high, a forest of rotting meat to greet the conqueror. Mothers with their infants, men with their brothers. Let Mehmed march through that. Let his soldiers breathe that air. By the time they reach these mountains, they will be vomiting their own courage into the dirt. Voica's hand slipped. A single drop of wine splashed onto the table. Vlad's head snapped toward her. For a heartbeat, she thought she was dead, but he merely looked through her, as if she were a piece of furniture that had squeaked. "We leave at moonrise," Vlad commanded, turning back to his captain. "Take the elite guard. Leave the rest to man the walls. They will delay the Turks long enough for us to cross into Transylvania." "And the women?" Dragos asked, glancing at Voica. "The servants?" Vlad waved his hand dismissively. "Leave them. The fortress needs to look inhabited. If the Turks find an empty shell, they will pursue us immediately. If they find people to kill, they will stop to enjoy themselves." The blood drained from Voica's face. They were bait. The women who had built these walls with their flesh were to be left as distractions, to buy the monster time to escape. As the council dispersed, Voica slipped away, hurrying up the winding stairs to the western ramparts. She needed to see. She needed to know how close death was. She reached the arrow slit and looked out toward the south, toward the capital. She could not see Targoviste. It was miles away, but she could see the sky. A haze of black smoke hung over the valley, thick and greasy. And then the wind shifted. It hit her like a physical blow. The smell. It was the scent of thousands of bodies baking in the June sun. It was the smell of death on an industrial scale. It choked the air, drowning out the scent of pine and river water. Even from this distance, the forest of the impaled cast its shadow. Below, on the winding road leading up the valley, she saw movement. Not the orderly march of a conquering army, but a chaotic halting. The vanguard of the Ottoman forces, the greatest military machine on earth, had stopped. Through the haze, she imagined she could see them. Hardened janissaries retching, horses rearing in panic, unable to step forward into the atrocity Vlad had prepared. The Sultan had turned his army around, just as the history books would later say. He could fight men, but he could not fight this. But while the main army might retreat, the scouts, the raiders, and the angry splinter groups would come here. They would come to Poenari, seeking revenge for the horrors they had witnessed in the valley. Voica backed away from the window, her hand going instinctively to the waistband of her tunic, feeling the cold outline of the mother-of-pearl knife. The sun was dipping below the peaks. Moonrise was only hours away. Vlad was leaving. The guards would be busy preparing the horses. The chaos of the evacuation was her only cover. She looked at her hands, scarred, strong, and shaking. She would not wait to be a distraction. She would not wait to be a victim. "Tonight," she whispered to the empty air. She turned and ran toward the servants' quarters. She had to find the map. She had to find the others. The forest of death waited below, but the river of life waited in the dark, and she would crawl through hell to reach it. The night did not fall. It was extinguished by the smoke of 1,000 torches. Below the cliffs of Poenari, the valley was a river of fire. The army of Radu the Handsome, Vlad's younger brother and the puppet of the Ottoman Sultan, had arrived. They did not come with the disorganized fury of a raid, but with the terrifying precision of a tide. Arrows tipped with flaming pitch arched over the ramparts, hissing like vipers before slamming into the wooden hoardings. Inside the fortress, the order had collapsed into a frantic scramble for survival. Voica crouched in the alcove of the servants' stairwell, her hand pressed flat against the cold stone, feeling the vibrations of the battering ram against the main gates far below. Beside her huddled 3 other women: Mara, a girl who had lost an eye to a guard's whip, and Doina, an older woman whose silence was heavier than stone. They were the last. The others were dead or hiding in holes that would soon become their tombs. "Is it time?" Mara whispered, clutching Voica's tunic. "Not yet," Voica breathed, her eyes fixed on the courtyard above. "We need the distraction." In the upper courtyard, the air was thick with panic. Servants ran aimlessly, clutching silver plate and furs, while the Kalarash elite guards saddled horses with frantic haste. Emerging from the great hall was Vlad. He wore blackened armor, his cape billowing like a stain of ink. He moved with a terrifying focus, heading not for the main gate, but toward the stables where the secret mountain path began, a narrow track known only to the goats and the desperate. He stopped near the western battlement. Standing there, silhouetted against the fiery sky, was his wife. The princess stood on the very edge of the precipice. The wind whipped her velvet gown around her legs, and her golden braids had come undone, flying wild around her face. She looked down into the abyss where the Argesh River roared, swollen with snowmelt and rain, crashing against the rocks hundreds of feet below. Vlad paused, his hand on his saddle. "The horses are ready," he shouted over the din of the siege. "We ride for Transylvania." The princess turned slowly. Her face was pale, illuminated by the fires of the enemy army, an army led by her husband's own brother. She looked at Vlad, then at the Turkish flags advancing up the slope. She knew what awaited a captured princess in the Sultan's court. It would be a life of silk pillows and golden chains, a jewel in a harem, a trophy of conquest. But she also looked at Vlad, the monster who had built this castle on the bones of women, who had impaled children to send a message. "I will not go to Hungary to be a beggar's wife," she said, her voice eerily calm amidst the screaming. "And I will not go to Istanbul to be a slave." Vlad's eyes narrowed. "Then stay and die. I have a kingdom to reclaim." He mounted his horse, turning his back on her without a second glance. The monster chose survival. The princess looked across the courtyard. Her eyes found the shadows of the servants' alcove. She saw Voica. A flash of recognition passed between them, the memory of a knife, a map, and a silent apology. The princess stepped up onto the crenellations of the wall. "My lord Radu!" she screamed into the night, her voice piercing the cacophony. "Tell your masters, I would rather be food for the fish of the Argesh than a prisoner of the Turks." The soldiers froze. The archers lowered their bows. For a heartbeat, the war stopped. Then, she jumped. There was no scream, just a flutter of blue velvet against the red sky, a dark shape plummeting into the churning white water below. She jumped! The princess jumped! The cry went up from the guards, creating a vortex of confusion. Soldiers ran to the wall, abandoning their posts to look down. "Now!" Voica hissed. She grabbed Mara's arm and bolted from the shadows. They did not run toward the stables where Vlad was escaping. They ran toward the kitchens. "Where are we going?" Doina gasped, stumbling. "The prince went that way." "The prince goes to hell," Voica snarled, hauling Doina up. "We go to the river." They burst into the pantry. Voica shoved aside a heavy sack of grain, revealing a low, narrow wooden door that matched the charcoal sketch on the parchment. It was the refuse chute, a tunnel used to dump waste into the river below. A guard stood there, his back to them, distracted by the commotion on the wall. He turned at the sound of their footsteps, drawing his sword. "Get back," he shouted. "No one leaves?" Voica did not stop. She did not plead. She didn't think. The months of lifting stone, the hunger, the rage, it all focused into a single point. She drew the mother-of-pearl knife from her sash. As the guard raised his sword, Voica lunged. She was small, but she was fast, and she had the strength of a woman who had carried a fortress on her back. She drove the small blade into the gap of his armor, just under the arm. The guard gasped, dropping his sword. He looked at her with shock, not realizing that the furniture could kill. Voica shoved him hard, and he slumped against the wall, sliding down into the dark. "Move," Voica commanded, kicking the door open. The tunnel was black and smelled of rot. It slanted sharply downward, a terrifying slide into the unknown. "We will die in there," Mara sobbed. "We are already dead here," Voica said. She looked back one last time. Through the window, She saw Vlad's figure disappearing up the mountain trail, alone. She looked at the blood on her hands. Not her blood this time. "Slide," Voica ordered. One by one, the women vanished into the dark earth, sliding down toward the river that had just swallowed a princess, praying it had room for 3 more survivors. The year was 1490. The autumn sun over the Saxon city of Brasov was gentle, filtering through the leaded glass window to warm the wooden table where Voica sat. Outside, the world was noisy with the sounds of merchants selling wool and blacksmiths hammering iron, the sounds of a life that had continued, indifferent to the horrors of the past. Inside, there was only the scratching of a quill against parchment. Voica paused, dipping the pen into the inkwell. She was an old woman now, her hair the color of the mountain snow. But it was her hands that told the story of her life. They were twisted, the knuckles swollen and misshapen, the skin mapped with white ridges of scar tissue that would never fade. To hold a pen was a daily battle against pain. The cramps came quickly, seizing her fingers, trying to force them into the curled, grasping shape they had taken while carrying limestone up a cliff. But she forced them open. She forced them to write. "Grandmother?" The door creaked open, and a small face peered in. It was Anna, her granddaughter, 7 years old and bright as a new copper coin. She held a wooden doll in one hand and a flower in the other. "Are you writing about the monster again?" Anna asked, stepping into the room. "The boys in the market say he drank blood. They say he was a demon who could turn into mist." Voica set the pen down. She beckoned the girl closer. "Come here, little bird." Anna climbed onto the bench beside her. She looked at the open book. It was not a ledger of coins or a prayer book. It was a list, column after column of names, written in Voica's shaky, determined hand. "The world loves monsters, Anna," Voica said softly, smoothing the girl's hair. "It is easier to believe in demons with fangs than to admit that a man did these things. A man who ate dinner, who prayed, who wrote letters." "Was he scary?" Anna whispered. "He was small," Voica corrected, "and petty, and cruel, but he is dead. His head sat on a stake in Constantinople years ago. The worms ate him, just as they eat beggars." She tapped the parchment with a crooked finger. "These people, these are the ones who matter. The boys in the market will not tell you their stories, so I must." Voica began to read, her voice raspy but steady. "Ilinka," she read, "who died because she was too tired to sew a shirt." She had a laugh that made the birds jealous. "Iliana," she continued, her finger tracing the next line, "who loved sweet pastries and hated the rain. She carried me when I could not walk." "Sophia," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. "Who was 14? Who liked to braid her hair with ribbons? She died so her mother would learn a lesson about bread." "And the lady," Voica said, touching the last entry, "who had no name in the histories, only a title. But she gave me a knife. She gave me a map. She gave us the river." Anna looked at the book with wide eyes. "There are so many. There are thousands," Voica said, "and I will write them all. Every stone in that castle has a name. Every drop of water in the Argesh has a face. As long as this book exists, he does not win. If we forget them, then he wins." The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the room. Voica closed the book. The pain in her hands was a dull throb now, a reminder of the price she had paid for this peace. "Come," Voica said, standing up with a groan of stiff joints. "Bring your flour." They walked out of the cottage, past the garden where pumpkins grew fat and orange, toward a small hillock overlooking the valley. There was no body buried there. The bodies were lost to the wolves and the river decades ago. Instead, there was a simple stone marker, rough-hewn and unpolished. It did not bear a single name, It bore a symbol carved by Voica's own hand years ago, a circle representing a ring broken in half. Voica stood before the stone. The wind tugged at her shawl. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was back there. She smelled the rot of the dungeon, felt the bite of the whip, heard the roar of the river swallowing the princess. But the terror did not come. The fear that had ruled her life for so long had finally withered, starved by the simple act of living. She opened her eyes and looked at the horizon. The mountains of Wallachia were far away, mere jagged lines in the distance. "Put the flower there, Anna," Voica said. The little girl placed the yellow wildflower on the cold stone. Voica smiled. It was not the polite, courtly smile of the girl she had been in 1457. It was the fierce, broken, beautiful smile of a woman who had walked through hell and walked back out. "He thought he could erase us." Voica spoke to the wind, her voice strong and clear. "He thought that by breaking our bodies, he could break our truth. He thought that because he was a prince and we were women, history belonged to him." She looked down at her granddaughter, then at her own scarred hands, the hands that had built a fortress for a tyrant, and then built a life for herself. "He was wrong," Voica whispered. "The castle is a ruin, the prince is dust. But we are still here. We are the ink, we are the stone, we are the story." She took Anna's hand, her grip firm and warm. "We have won." They turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the stone and the flower bathing in the golden light of the setting sun. Behind them, the silence of the evening was not the silence of the dead, but the peaceful silence of a story that has finally been told. Voica's journey teaches us a powerful lesson for our own lives. True strength is not always found in the hands that hold weapons, but in the hearts that refuse to give up. We all face our own mountains, moments of suffering, injustice, or overwhelming grief where we feel powerless. But Voica shows us that even when stripped of everything, we still possess the power of our own spirit. The greatest victory against darkness is not violence, but endurance. As long as you keep moving, as long as you speak your truth and refuse to let the world erase who you are, you have already won. Voica spent her life writing down names so they would never be forgotten. Now, you have heard them too. You can help keep their memory alive. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video so the world knows the truth behind the legend. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to uncover more forgotten voices from history. Let us pray. May God grant you the unshakable strength to carry your burdens and the courage to walk through your darkest nights. May He protect you from the cruelty of this world and give you the peace that comes after the storm. May you always have the light to write your own story of victory. If you receive this blessing and believe in the power of resilience, type Amen in the comments below.